Okay, now we'll talk about the development of the maxilla. Again, we're back to the fourth week. The maxilla begins to develop off of those two processes from the first pharyngeal arches, just below the frontal process and beside the stomodium. We see these two small wedge-shaped processes that form off of the mandibular arch, and these are going to give rise to the cheeks and the side of the upper lip. If you look at this diagram, you can color your maxillary process. Starting in the fourth week, you can just barely see the budding off the side. Then they get larger by the fifth week, and they start growing toward the midline just through this differential growth of those nasal placodes. They are starting to get closer together. So if you want to color the maxillary process yellow throughout all of this, you'll see where it forms and joins. As a further extension of that maxillary process, what you see on the outside is, the upper part of the lip forming, but we also start to see a further projection or process that comes off of that maxillary process, and it will eventually form the palate. Now, the palate forms the floor of the nasal cavities and will complete the division of the stomodium into the oral and nasal cavities. So this portion of the development of the palate doesn't start to form until around week 7, once those maxillary processes start to get a little closer together and start to fuse with the medial nasal process. If you were to view the roof of the stomodium, so imagine yourself standing in a dome and looking up at the ceiling. Right now it is a large dome shape. In the center of that dome, dropping down in the midline, would be the part that is the nasal septum. That has come from the medial nasal process. But you're going to start to see these shelves growing across toward each other on the left and the right side. And there'll also be a part at the front of the dome that is growing inward toward the back. Each of these portions will eventually meet and fuse. So these ingrowths are all coming from different portions of what we saw on the outside. The portion at the front that's growing inward is called the medial palatine process. And this has grown off of originally the frontal process that then became that medial nasal process, and now a further process off of that called the medial palatine process. And this is going to form that anterior part of the maxilla, the palate, just in the area of like from 3 to 3 approximately. Now those tissues are not there yet, the teeth are not there yet, so but it starts about that area. And then as the shelves start to grow across, they're coming from the maxillary process, and we call these the lateral palatine shelves. So there'll be one on the left and one on the right, and they're going to grow eventually toward each other. But it doesn't quite happen as simply as that, of course. So let's go to the medial palatine process. It's going to grow in the medial nasal process is going to grow in length, and there'll be an additional bulge at the bottom of it growing toward and inward toward the stomodium, called the medial palatine process. This forms a single structure just below the nasal pits and between the maxillary processes left and right. The left and right palatal shelves grow from the first pharyngeal arch, and then that maxillary process grows off of that, and then a further extension grows off of the maxillary process. Initially, they actually grow downward into the floor of the sternodium, and at the same time the tongue and the mandible are growing. So they are forming, and we'll talk about how they form in a little bit. But at this point in time, the tongue is kind of in the way. Now, I'll talk about this process where those palatal shelves were once pointing down, and they'll fuse together in a Y-shaped fusion once they've completed. But right now, at this point, the tongue is in the way. So we have to get the palatal shelf elevation piece. So initially they're growing downward because the tongue is in its way. And the anterior portion of the medial palatine process is growing inward toward the back of the sternodium. In the length of time it takes to swallow, the tongue rapidly drops down and gets pulled forward and out of the way, and it causes the tongue to push the left and right palatine shelves toward each other so that they can then begin to fuse. So it's at that point in time that all three structures all three parts, the medial palatine and the left and the right lateral palatine processes, can actually come in contact with each other. They'll fuse together, and they'll also fuse with the nasal septum. So here is a diagram where we're looking at the roof of the sternodium. In diagram A, this central piece here is our nasal septum, and this is the medial palatine process that is growing inward from the medial nasal process, and then the left and the right palatine shelves, or the lateral palatine processes, depending on which textbook you're looking at, but they're all the same thing. So as you can see, they start to fuse in a Y shape, and then it basically zippers up all the way. In this next diagram, this is a histological cross-section. So what we're looking at is a cross-section through the sternodium, and all of the white areas that you see here are part of the sternodium, but of course now all these structures are starting to form in here. So this piece right here in the middle is the nasal septum. Imagine this was once a big ball, a big white ball. This is our nasal septum. Down here is the tongue, and so the tongue is growing straight up in the oral sternodium at this point in time. Here's our left and right palatine shelves that are growing downward beside the tongue. In the next diagram, the tongue drops down to the floor of the mouth and forward, and it actually starts to push these lateral palatine shelves up. They will fuse with the nasal process, they will fuse with each other, and that will then create the left and right nasal cavities. Our nasal septum is in the middle, fused palatal shelves, and then now this is our oral cavity with our tongue, and this would be the bone that's forming on each side of the tongue in the mandible, and eventually the bone will form in here. Here's another schematic drawing of the very same thing. And another view of looking at the nasal septum and the left and right palatine shelf as it grows toward. On this view, the tongue's in the way, then the tongue drops down and out of the way, and the palatine shelves come up together. And here is our line of fusion. When they first contact each other, they'll fuse starting here, and they'll zipper up, basically, all the way down. So as a result of the palatine processes and the medial nasal processes, the stomotium now has been divided into three cavities, right and left nasal cavity and an oral cavity. Most of the palate forms through intramembranous bone formation. So this is where we have the membrane package that is first laid down with immature bone and then is replaced with mature secondary bone. I've put this slide in here as a reminder for you, the two different ways that bone grows together, forms intramembranously and endochondrally. And the endochondral one is the precursor made up of cartilage that is invaded in the center, and this is how all of our long bones grow, and most of our flat bones grow in an intramembranous formation. So just so that you have a bit of a reminder of that. Okay, we're going to stop this one, and you have a chance to go and take a look at the video.